Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Inside the Birds TV presented by DraftKings. I'm Jeff Mosher alongside Adam Kaplan. And it's been a while, Adam, since we've had a guest on the show, but we're really excited about this one because joining us today is former Eagles assistant linebackers coach Ryan Paganetti, who was also Doug Pederson's kind of right-hand man up in the booth on in-game analytics decisions, game management decisions, had a lot to do with analytical projects in the Eagles for quite a while, from Chip Kelly into the Doug Pederson era. So we're going to get a lot of information in this episode from Ryan. He's going to talk to us about analytics, the state of the franchise involving analytics, how they've used it in the past, how they're using it now, how it compares to the rest of the NFL. And so we're gonna sit back and learn a lot from Ryan. Ryan, we really appreciate you coming on with us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I'm excited about it.
You got it. Before we even get to stuff, I want to give people kind of an idea of exactly who you are, where you came from, because you were kind of like that guy in the booth that a lot of people knew Doug was relying on fourth down or going for two, but couldn't match the face with the name. Now they can. You are Ivy League educated. You went to Dartmouth. You're from Massachusetts. I believe your first job in the NFL in 2013 was with the Cowboys, right, as a scouting intern.
Yeah, so before my senior year in college, I did that.
Right. But you really kind of became who you were in the NFL with the Eagles when Chip Kelly hired you. You survived the coaching change from Chip to Doug, and then you kind of emerged as Doug's right-hand man for what I said, a lot of analytics decisions and, of course, projects and things, along with coaching assistant linebackers. So let me start with asking you about your time with the Eagles under two different coaches, your role as it grew. What were your primary responsibilities, and what are some of the things that maybe the Eagles do now that you have some of your fingerprints on, or at least you through either Chip or Doug?
So, I mean, over time it transitioned a little bit, but when I was first starting, I really was like pretty much exclusively focused on analytics. And I sort of fell into a situation when Chip's staff was moved to Doug's staff. Like I had an opportunity to stick around, and actually sort of by chance, Doug had a lot smaller staff to start out with. And there was like various coaches that sort of needed help with things, and whether it was like more like coaching related tasks rather than just doing exclusively analytics. So I started helping out Jeff Stelton or Deuce Staley or Ken Flagel, because like in the past they had like specific assistants and they didn't necessarily have the same, manpower there. And it was great for me. So like that Doug's first season, I was like in all these offensive meetings, kind of learning how the game planning worked and all that whole process. But for me, like I had always wanted to do coaching, but I was more of this perspective of like my value added proposition was like the analytical side. And I was sort of lucky that I kind of fell into this scenario where I could basically end up doing both. And then so ultimately, my job really kind of functioned as like a quality control type person on the defensive side of the ball. And that was probably like 50% of my time. And then the other 50% of my time was really like helping out Coach Pederson with like in-game analytics, whether that was like fourth downs, 2-point conversions, when to call timeouts, when to accept or decline a penalty, like to some degree, like when you might challenge a play, and just various other things that would come up through the course of a game. And then like during the season, just like I would help out with offense, defense, and special teams with like game planning. So like situational stuff or, tendencies on opponents or self-scouting, or like here's some information that, from an analytics perspective can like complement your game plan. And I had a lot of fun with that. Like it was really cool because we had a lot of coaches that were really receptive to that stuff. And I know in other places they, try to maybe do some similar things, and the coaches just sort of like not very bought in, and it makes it sort of an awkward situation because like it's like you're just like presenting some information and they just don't care. But so I've had like some colleagues around the NFL reach out and they're like asking me advice of like, how do I like convince this coach, because he just does not want to do anything to do with this stuff. And to me, Doug being like a new head coach was definitely like a positive because he was receptive to this stuff. And I think some of these coaches that might have 20, 30 years of experience, like they're just so much less likely to want to change things because, they probably won a lot of games in the NFL and they have a certain mindset of how to win, and that's fine. And there's like obviously different approaches that can succeed. But Doug was so receptive to that stuff, and it really was fun. And he really kind of like gave me like an open opportunity to like present pretty much anything to him. So there was things that, he definitely was kind of ahead of the league in terms of using data and analytics because of that standpoint. And he really sort of like set the stage for, following the 2017 season for all these other teams to be like, all right, what are the Eagles doing? Like, do we need to copy this analytics format that they're doing? Like, because, they just won the Super Bowl. So I think that was pretty cool. And like, it definitely was just incredibly exciting to be a part of the whole, operation.
Ryan, you mentioned how the Eagles have been an analytical building. Does that start with Jeffrey Lurie, the owner? What do you think because Jeff and I have talked on our show for years now that Jeffrey's someone who seems to back it, but how much does he, as someone who's involved in it, how much does he set the table for you guys wanting to do it or needing to do it?
Honestly, I think I would say he probably is the absolute most important person to getting that buy-in because, he was always in Coach Pederson's ear and like encouraging him and being like, hey, I believe in numbers. Like I've like reviewed this information. Like we've invested a lot of resources in analytics and like, we feel really great about this stuff. Like, so just like at the very least consider like at the end of the day, you're the head coach, make your own decisions, but like take a look at this stuff because there's some suggestions and recommendations that are, kind of go against the grain. And maybe that's that edge that can, take our team to the next level. But, really just like Mr. Lurie did, I think an incredible job of, like being positive with Coach Pederson and encouraging him and, just really setting the stage for Coach Pederson in particular to like, let him know that like, if things don't work, if you go for some of these aggressive fourth downs, yes, like you're going to get murdered by the Philly media and the ESPN media and Skip Bayless and Stephen A are going to be calling you to get fired. But like at the end of the day, like, if it's like backed by data and you can like justify it with like numbers, like I'm cool with it because I know over the long term, like this stuff's going to work out for us. So I think really Jeffrey Lurie really played a critical role there. And I think his role is like underestimated by the fan base of like, really what he was doing there.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point about the fishbowl environment in Philly, and you being Doug's right-hand man on some of those decisions almost are like the Wizard of Oz. You're the nameless, faceless guy who's advising Doug on some of these decisions. I want to kind of ask you about that whole process and what it entailed both mentally as far as like emotion and in the moment. First, I want to remind everyone, download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. Use promo code ITB to receive $200 in free bets when you place a $1 bet on any week one game. So Ryan, like knowing how important those analytics decisions were to the ownership and front office and how embracing of it Doug was compared to other coaches. I mean, I remember that 2017 season, and I think we will all say that a lot of those decisions on fourth down or going for two were instrumental in the team winning the Super Bowl. But I remember early on, say the Giants, I don't know if you remember week 3, mm-hmm. Doug went for it on 4th and 8 at midfield and didn't get it. And everybody was like, what is this guy doing? But obviously, you're in the booth, and I'm sure you're anticipating the next day he's going to be asked about it. He's going to get thrown under the bus if we lose. What was that whole experience like for you, knowing that a lot of these decisions don't always fit well with the people, kind of cringe when they hear analytics out.
So I would say in general, that was probably in my 5 years, like the most controversial fourth down we ever went for.
No doubt.
And at the time, no one knew what I was doing. Like it was not public information, who I was or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to get too much into the specifics of that individual moment, but I'll say that like that situation from like an analytics perspective was like very, very borderline. Like you could make the case either way. And, depending on, you might look at one model that would say, all right, that's like a clear punt. Another model might be like, all right, it's kind of a toss up. And another one might be like, all right, it's leaning a little bit towards, going for it. And I think Doug is like an offensive coach. Like he wanted to be aggressive in some of those situations. And, he felt good about whatever play they had at the time. And, he tried to, roll the dice in a situation that was sort of like, from an analytics perspective, like it was close enough that it wasn't a big deal either way, but it didn't work, and then thank God, like our defense had like an amazing stop right at the end of the half, I think. And like, we stopped them at the goal line. Mm-hmm. And, I think was that the game where Jake Elliott had the
63 yarder. Yeah.
So, that game was really interesting in particular because like that moment, like I did not feel great. And I'm like, like I almost felt like I, to some degree, like hung him out to dry a little bit because, just the optics of it. And it was so controversial.
Was that also difficult throughout the whole year and tenure to have to, like, these are real pivotal in-game decisions that can swing a game one way or another, and you're in a big city here.
So yeah, I mean, so like just to kind of like follow from that moment, like the actual towards the end of the game, like I really like thought it was like one of my like better moments, because I think there was a scenario that came up, and the Giants had the ball at like something like the 35 or on their own 35, and there was like a very small amount of time left in the game. And I was like walking Doug through this situation, and I'm like, look, if they get stopped short of any distance here and it brings up a fourth down, like I very strongly would recommend calling a timeout just to force them to punt the ball. And at the time, like it was like that was kind of controversial. All right, what if they're in 4th and inches and they go for it, they get it or whatever? But like I really felt from like a numerical standpoint, like that was going to be a really great opportunity for us, and we would even almost want them to go for a fourth and a half yard or whatever from their own 30 or whatever it was. But anyways, that it was like some longer distance to go, and then that exact distance, they like on the 3rd down, they got exactly up to like inches to go. Doug instantly calls timeout, and then they end up they were a little bit jacked up because they're like, all right, well, what do we do here? Like, do we go for this? Do we punt or whatever? And then they ended up like being sort of dysfunctional. They sent out the punt team unit, and it was kind of like a terrible punt. And all of a sudden we were in business, and then we hit like a play to like Alshon or whatever, and then we kicked the field goal. But like to me, I was like, that was like a great example of like how we really prepared from an analytics standpoint. We saved every single possible second. Like Alshon's play, I think, ended with like 1 second on the clock. That was like just the fact that we were prepared in that moment. Like I felt great about it. But then after the game, either like that day or the next morning, like Doug like mentioned me that I was like helping him out. And from that moment on, like I had the people on the radio and sports radio in Philly like saying that like this guy has no idea what he's doing.
Exactly.
Like, they need a new coach. Like this is a disaster. Like articles crushing me, man. Like people like,
who is this guy?
Like dumping on me, and I'm like, oh god. Like so, I was fortunate that like we ended up, I think, winning like 8 straight games or 9 straight games right after that moment. So like the heat kind of was like off me a little bit, but I was like, at one point I'm like, do I need to like worry about like going home at night and stuff?
Exactly.
Oh yeah. Witness protection, baby.
Yeah. And I'm like, oh man. So it was kind of wild, but then we were fortunate too that like we ended up in a lot of like 4th and like inches or like 4th and a half yard type situations in those following games, and we just like kept running a bunch of sneaks and converting them. And I think like Doug's confidence in the 4th downs and the team's confidence like really was high, and even just some of the teams we were going against, they were just like demoralized when we would just like smash it forward on like 4th down and get it. And it's pretty deflating. You get a team to 4th down, you think you maybe get them off the field, and then you got to deal with a whole new series. But from that moment, it was just sort of interesting. We were just rolling, and we just kept. Doug was like, you know what? I'm an offensive coach. I want to keep the offense on the field. Like, let's just keep doing this. And it pretty much like we had a very high conversion rate all the way up and like through the Super Bowl, obviously.
Ryan, 2016 though, what was the buy-in like from Doug immediately? Like, did it take him a while? And also the other coaches you mentioned in passing, early in here, that some older coaches may not. I'm not talking specifically with Eagles, but it could be any team where they're not deep in analytics. They don't understand it. They're old school. How long did it take you to get buy-in with the coaches and really, quite frankly, Doug Pederson?
So I think just again, like Mr. Lurie's influence that first year was really critical because, right off the bat, like he was encouraging Doug, and I don't even know like how it was determined that I would be up in the booth, but at some point, like way before the season, they're just like, hey, you want to help out during the games? I'm like, yeah, that sounds awesome. Like I was a little nervous at first. I'm like, all right, like, well, 2 years ago, I was like basically helping a high school out, like and then it all of a sudden could be out in front of 30 million people every week. And like, so, I mean, I thought I was prepared, but I was definitely a little nervous at first, but, I'd say in general, like I tried to scale back like the stuff that is in some people would perceive to be like borderline insane, like from an analytics standpoint. So like to that first year, it was like the ones that were like clear wins on like 4th downs or like a clear win on like, hey, use this time out here and you save X amount of time. Like it was pretty straightforward to communicate. And like, say, for example, more like 4th and 1s and 4th and 2s that first year, as opposed to like the next year, we were like going for 4th and 3 at the Rams, like in a critical situation, like the play before Carson tore his ACL, if you guys remember that one.
Yep.
Down there on the goal line or whatever. But So it was more, I think it was more like that first year was almost like a little bit of a test. And even with like the 2-point conversion stuff, we were more like vanilla there. But I think, Doug felt we did some good things in 2016. And like, he just had a great like vision that he like really felt like, if I buy in even more from 2016 to 17, like this could end up making the difference.
So Ryan, let me go back to Chip Kelly a little bit, because even though he's a popular punching bag in Philadelphia for how things ended, I believe a lot of what the Eagles do now, from a sports science standpoint and analytics as well, are rooted in him and what he brought to this team. So, because you were with both coaching staffs and up with the team up until this past spring, what are things that the Eagles do now that you think are directly traceable to what Chip brought in from an analytics and sports science standpoint?
So I think on the sports science side, like, it would have been like kind of foolish of the team to just completely like not consider the success that Chip had from like an injury prevention standpoint. And I know there's like a metric like Football Outsiders adjusted games lost, which is like one of the more trustworthy metrics of like, all right, how many like starter games were lost around the league? And like Chip's 3 years were like exceptional all 3 years. And like that was also dealing in scenarios where like the offense and defense were playing a ton of snaps. And like, so there were certain things, whether it was like, measuring hydration or like heart rate variability, or, changing the practice structure to maybe, doing shorter practices or doing like dynamic stretching before practice rather than static, or various like rehab protocols, or like certain additional athletic trainers that were brought in, that could do like certain treatments. Like there was just a huge investment from Chip, and like Chip was basically treating these guys like they were like Olympic athletes, like playing for a gold medal. Like every single player on the team was going to get like the gold standard of treatment to like take care of their health. And I think he was really ahead of the game on that standpoint. And now you see that like virtually every sport, it's like they all have a sports science department. I mean, most teams didn't even have a sports science department at the time. So, but at the time, like, he had Josh Hanks and Sean Holes, and those were kind of his like top guys for strength conditioning and sports science. And like they retained those guys and they stuck around for a few more years, and we ended up winning the Super Bowl with those guys in those same roles. So that was definitely important. But at the same time, you kind of have to just go with how like the coach's vision or how the front office's vision is for like, how are we going to orient practice? How are we going to orient like the roster and things like that? So there definitely were some different things. Like Doug's practices were like a lot tougher, and, they were a lot longer. And, there's certain ways that certain coaches like doing things, or certain front offices, like, maybe they allocate things on the roster differently. Like one thing that Chip did that I thought was like also like pretty impressive was he put a massive resource on special teams. Like that, like it was so important to him that everyone was good on special teams. And then, whether you're taking your last few roster spots on an active game day, like those guys were going to be like Chris Maragos, like Brian Brayman, like guys that could really be difference makers in the special teams units. And I think he had gotten a good influence from, Coach Belichick, who was always like really, put a huge investment on that. And, I think that worked out pretty well. And, like there was a few years there where like Dave Phipps groups were just like dominant. They're like blocking kicks like almost every week. And there was just like a different sort of like resource allocation with like the different front office that took over after Chip. And I think they were more using the like later draft picks. And like there's not a right or wrong answer, and you might have different like analytical models, but they were more using like the later roster spots on things like, additional offensive lineman or an additional quarterback, or like a developmental receiver, or like, a guy maybe we trade for a safety or something. And, like they need time to learn things and things like that. And I think Chip's perspective was more like, let's get the 46 or 53 guys that can like help us win this week. And like I want my 44th and 45th and 46th guy to like do something important in the game. And I think that the group that kind of like ended up taking over, that they were doing a little bit more of like keeping a lot of offensive linemen or different, like, just from a roster standpoint, maybe there was a little bit less of a weight on like, all right, how good is this guy as a linebacker, or how good of this guy as a running back, and less of a weight on like, all right, how good of a gunner is he, or like, if that makes sense. So it's just a different perspective. And obviously we ended up having some success with that too, but you could kind of see like the special teams drop off a little bit over the last couple of years. And I think at the end of the day, that was a little bit, Dave Phipps still an incredible coach. Like I know sometimes some of the local media was like taking shots at him or whatnot, but like the guy has had groups that were near the top of the league in the NFL. But I think to some degree it was just a organizational decision of how they were allocating resources that was sort of to explain, some of the differences.
Yeah, I would say my time covering the league in terms of training camps, no team I've ever seen spent more time with special teams periods than the Eagles did under Chip Kelly, and that would explain what you were talking about, how great they were. Not just good, at times they were great. They were best, you could argue, in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
But Ryan, getting back to your situation, how much do you think, being a guy who played football, because most analytic guys, not all, but most did not play football or did not at least play college football. So how much did that help you with your sort of transition from going from just a football player, and I know you're an economics major at Dartmouth, but going from that to be an analytics guy, because sometimes I don't know if you could get both to kind of match up.
Yeah, no, and I think that I sort of kind of wanted to market myself as like more of this hybrid person. And like, I really wanted to help the coaches as much as possible, even if it was like elementary tasks, like drawing plays or like holding, bags or like, lining up in formations for them. Like, I just wanted to like build these relationships with these guys. And also like, I think it really helped like my credibility as like an analyst when they saw that like I'm in all these coaching meetings, like I'm in every single one of Jim Schwartz's meetings, like I can make the adjustments, like I can teach like, our cover 3 defense to the guys. And I think by me, building that knowledge base on offense, defense, and special teams, like that really, helps me ask like good questions, like from an analytics perspective, maybe like a person that's exclusively analytics or doesn't have a football background, maybe they have an analysis and they miss like a very critical piece of information. Like I know at one point there was like some landmark study, like somewhere, maybe it was like the end of like the like 2008, 2009 or so, there was some landmark study by some like brilliant guy, and it got all this media attention. And he basically said that every team should like throw the ball 85+%.
Yeah.
And the reality is like he made some like very elementary mistakes, like not factoring in that like 2-minute situations, like defenses are lining completely different, or like things that you would know, like as like from like a coaching perspective that you really would like want to pull out of your analysis, because like obviously a 2-minute situation is not really representative of like a 1st and 10 in the first quarter, because you're facing just a totally different scenario. You might be allowing yards because you're just managing the clock, or you might be facing totally different, easier defenses because they're just, they don't want to give up the big plays because they're fine with a 5-yard gain. So I think just, just being able to continually learn. And like, for me, like I sort of treated it like I was getting like a PhD in like football IQ when I'm like sitting in Coach Schwartz's meeting, or sitting in like, a meeting with Frank and Doug Peterson, and like learning exactly why they're doing things. And that would allow me to like test things like, okay, if this is why they're doing things, like, can I question like the why of that, and can I study that, and can I analyze it? And that was like something I kind of mentioned. I did this like Forbes article recently that like, there was this perception around the league that you like couldn't run quarterback sneaks against like certain looks, or like, if they're aligned in a way, you just got to call something else. And like, I sort of challenged that from like a number standpoint and analyzing it. And like, it had really turned out that like, there was a lot of scenarios where teams should just run quarterback sneaks anyways. And so like, you saw, like we would do that in 2017, and, a team would have 11 guys up there tight, and it was a half yard to go. And rather than like, running a toss play or like getting in shotgun and like throwing a sprint out, we just jammed it up in there. We kept converting them because, realistically, the data was very supportive of like, despite the fact that it wasn't an ideal situation, the conversion rates were still going to be better than any other option. So I think that was kind of like an example of, just trying to learn from coaches. Like for that one, for example, like I spent a lot of time with like Coach Steltland, who's like an amazing coach, and he was always so receptive to numbers and analytics. And I actually think that, like that's a great thing about them keeping Coach Steltland, is because like he was always very open to like seeing what, even though he's kind of like an old school coach and like, he's got a lot of experience, like he was very open to, what would analytics say from like a game planning standpoint, like what's something that you could do against the Atlanta Falcons week 1 that could, help the run game. I know he's the run coordinator as well, but yeah, no, I had a lot of fun with that stuff. And it was always really cool to like see something that, maybe I was studying actually happen in a game. And I'm like, yeah, that's like sweet. Like,
yeah. And we should probably talk about Ryan, just because when the common person hears analytics, I think their first thought is athletic testing, speed, spark score, things like that. But I think when you're talking about working with coaches and how you are able to deliver them information that's helpful, that is also very relevant and not just based on testing. You're able to get coaches, like for Jeff Stalin, right? He's the offensive line coach. So I imagine you're able to pull up if they're playing the Cowboys on any given day. Well, how often are the Cowboys in a 4-down lineman front? How often are they in a 3-down lineman front? How often do they flow their defense one way versus the other way? How many formations do they put out with either 2 linebackers, 3 linebackers, nickel, dime? All that stuff is very, very relevant, I would imagine. And I don't know that the common person understands that that's a big part of the analytics that help kind of in game planning for coaches, from the head coach down to the position coaches, correct?
Yeah, and I'd say the word analytics sometimes is not the most representative of at times the things that I was doing, or at times things that could be helpful. And it's almost like at times you're just sort of relying on statistics or just large amounts of data, and you're not for example, a typical convention that was going around the league is, a team might take 3 or 4 games and break them down and here's this team's run pass tendency on 1st and 10 or 2nd and 1 to 2 and things like that. And my thing was we have the data to do 16 games. We have the data to do 3 years worth if we're going up against, Jason Garrett or Scott Linehan or something. We have so much more data that, with larger sample sizes, you can say something confidently. You might have had 3 snaps of the Dallas Cowboys with Scott Linehan in your 3 or 4 game sample of them in 2nd and 1 to 2. And then you're going to say, yeah, they passed, 66% of the time on 2nd and 1 to 2. And then all of a sudden you look at 3 years worth of Scott Linehan and they've run it 88% of the time on 2nd and 1 to 2. And it's all right, well, what's more useful? So for me, a lot of times, giving some kind of cross check to the game planning that they would typically do and, give them larger data if they were saying okay, I think they're going to do this, or, this is what they seem to have for a tendency, and then be able to show some supporting evidence. Okay, maybe the larger sample says the same thing, but maybe it says something different. And then that was definitely really helpful, I think, for those guys to, particularly just things that they couldn't do from a technical standpoint, or they just didn't have time to, take a look at. And it just sort of helped build confidence in whatever they were doing from a game plan standpoint.
Ryan, when you look at the situation in 2017, so we talked about 2016 and how Doug got a pretty big buy-in, and Jeffrey Lurie obviously was certainly the one that wanted him to do it, and Doug bought in. He used it to his effectiveness. Why was it so successful? Because Doug gave you credit sometimes without mentioning your name. He just said the numbers supported them going for it and 4th down in certain situations. Why were they? We know the roster was better, but it seemed like every decision worked. Why do you think that? Was it just better execution from the players, matching numbers? Why did it do so well?
One thing I'd say is at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of variation because there is just such small samples. You might only go for a few 4th and 1s and 4th and 2s over the course of the year. So to some degree, we were kind of lucky. It was a team just shooting a lot of 3s and making them because we kind of outperformed what you would expect. Maybe on average you convert 65% of your 4th and 1s, and we converted 100% that year. But what I would say is for me particularly, I had a very different role. Not, I guess from a game planning standpoint in 2017, because that 2016 season I was helping out with the in-game, management stuff, but my role was not as much involved with game planning. And that was partly just because I think Coach Pederson wasn't so familiar of really what it could do from a game planning standpoint. And I was more just just doing what I was asked to do type vibe, because I had been just held over from Chip's staff. And I'm not trying to step on any toes or go walk into the head coach's office and tell him to run inside zone on 1st and 10. I was more I'm just doing what I'm asked to do. And in that 2017 offense, our off season, we really sat down and I spent a lot of time with Coach Pederson, and I proposed a bunch of ideas of, presenting information to him and presenting information to Frank and, Jim and Coach Stelton and those guys on a weekly basis. And I'm I think there's a lot of data that, could be useful to game planning, and you don't have to use it, but you can at least take a look at it and see if it's helpful. And, I'd like to do this. And Coach Pederson was yeah, why didn't you do this last year? I'm well, I wasn't going to step on any toes or anything. But then, so right off the bat, I had a different role where I was really sort of strongly, I guess definitely more involved in game planning from a number standpoint. I think we were still doing a similar amount of going for 4th downs and whatnot, but the actual schematic stuff, I was a little bit more actively involved that second year. And then I think, that was like also a deal where like it was, my name was kind of on the line too when we're going for like a 4.5 yard and things like that. So part of me, rather than just be like the analytics guy that was just like, oh, just go for the fourth downs and it doesn't work. Like, who cares? Like, I tried to like come up with like data and tangible like ideas of like, not only like would this be like a go for fourth down situation, but like here's some like research backing up formations to use or personnel groups or like motions or, things that could tangibly like impact the actual play call as well. And I think that was definitely helpful for Coach Pederson. And we ended up, really kind of jumping our like quarterback sneak numbers or just different. We did a ton of RPOs that year and things like that. I think there were certain things from like a data standpoint that stood out in terms of, that we started doing a lot more that second year.
One thing I just want to follow up with, when you would present, whether it's the off season or helping in game planning, whatever your ideas were, would you back it up with film? Because I know sometimes when analytic people present, if you don't have film to back it up, that's why coaches could be dismissive.
Yeah, no, that was something for me. Like I was like borderline psychotic about like the last thing I ever wanted to do was like go walk into an NFL head coach's office and present some information and like it be wrong or something. So like I would literally watch every single snap that I was ultimately going to use the data on and just like verify that what I was like saying was legitimate. Like there was, we ran these like wham. I don't know if you guys would know what like a wham concept is or whatever, but like we ran a ton of those that year. And like, I would have like some data supporting like those plays were really explosive. And, we had a bunch of big runs with like Garrett on that stuff. But I would like go into Coach Pederson's office and try to like make a case for that. But like, I'd first like study all the wham plays that, the Giants faced or, all the wham plays from the season in the NFL. And like, rather than just say like, hey, these plays outperform, maybe we should look into this concept. It was more like, I wanted to like verify what was being said. And then like, there definitely would be times where like, I would have like coaches almost like call BS on something that I said. And they're like, there's no way. And I'd have to like go make a cut up for them and show them this or show them that. So I definitely have some like battles with different people, but like, it was good. And sometimes they were right. Like, I mean, maybe I like did make a little mistake here or there, or like maybe like the way that I might have defined something was different than how like a certain coach called something and things like that. But, for the most part, I think it was good to sort of like cross check and it made it so easy for them because then they, maybe I show an offensive line coach something and then he can show his players because he like already has a cut up made of like what maybe he wants to do.
All right, Ryan, I want to ask you a little bit about analytics involved in the draft, but I feel like we have to level with our audience and let them know that what you did was mostly game management, right? You are not a part of the analytics staff that is headed by, at one point it was Andrew Berry and now it's Alec Halaby. I just want to make that important distinction. And I'm correct with that, right? You are not part of that staff. Okay. The second thing I want to tell our audience is that your brother, TJ, is still a coach on the team. He's an assistant position coach, offensive line. Correct?
Yeah.
All right. So just so people know, we're not going to sit here and ask you about company secrets and things like that because we respect that relationship that your brother has with the team, along with the relationship you had with the team. But I do want to get into like kind of the draft philosophy that maybe you observed there while you were there. First, I want to remind people, visit our friends at Deal Dash or download the Deal Dash app. When you register, use the promo code ITB for a special offer for bonus free bids. That's promo code ITB to get bonus free bids. So we've had on this show a lot of different high-ranking personnel people, Bill Polian, Joe Banner, people who not affiliated with the Eagles, and we always seem to ask them about their philosophy on how analytics is used in the football department and how much should be used in the draft. And I would say by and large, a lot of the feedback we get is from those people is that analytics are very important, but you kind of have to draw a line when you're talking about evaluating draft prospects on how much you're using or the way in which you're using. But we also know that the Eagles tend to value analytics with the draft, especially not this year's, but maybe the prior two. What is your just overall philosophy on how analytics should be used, if at all, when you're evaluating draft prospects?
So I would say in general, like, I think the subjective process is always going to be it's always going to be the most important thing. And really some of the more like recent models, like projecting player talent, like they factor in the subjective like talent of the players. Like you might have your scouts grades or, some like public models, like Football Outsiders does some interesting stuff where like they'll take like, whatever the Scouts Inc. grades are and things like that to, you know, sort of add that into their model that might project a guy off of like his yardage and his physical attributes and things like that. But I think it's really useful from like a cross-check standpoint. Like I would say like I would almost like build like a completely subjective draft board, and then like I would just have like a analytics cross-check and like what are some things that very clearly are showing up that, you know, like are alarming red flags. Like, okay, like 26-year-old draft picks that are tight ends, like, you know, the success rate's incredibly low, or like offensive linemen that have a certain, you know, body weight or a certain, you know, arm length, or there's definitely like certain things that to me like would not as much like boost guys, but more so like pull guys down on your subjective board and just like sort of give you a flag, or even just like I think to some degree just understanding like, you know, what is like the market of players for like the free agent market compared to the draft. So like, okay, if running backs aren't making much money in the free agent market, like why are you spending like premium resources in the draft on that? You know, if quarterbacks are making all this money, you know, if offensive linemen are making all this money, or pass rushers, like, you know, it makes sense to use your premium draft picks on, you know, the positions that are going to command higher salaries in the NFL, because you're like getting that like cost controlled position. But I think it's the analytical stuff is like most helpful just from a standpoint of just like pointing out maybe guys you don't want to take rather than guys like that you definitely do want to take. And then maybe later on, like undrafted free agency, or like later on in the draft when it's kind of like a crapshoot, you know, find some guys that, you know, maybe an analytical model like spits out and says like, oh man, like, you know, this guy's projection is like, this guy's a starter in the NFL and he's sitting there in the 7th round. Like, you know, we don't have any other options. Like we might as well just, you know, throw a dart at this guy and, you know, try to put the numbers in your advantage. But I think early on, like some teams have kind of got burned a little bit by like maybe overweighting some analytical models and like thinking, you know, overly relying on it. Like this is not baseball. It's not as simple as like a one-on-one interaction. Like even like evaluating the running back position is just a dumpster fire. Like there's guys every year that are undrafted free agents that are like legitimate good NFL players that just slip through the cracks. And then there's guys taken in the 1st or 2nd round. And they're just like, I mean, how many guys were taken early on in last year's draft? Like that were, how much different are they than James Robinson of the Jaguars? Like probably not much, but it's like, it's really hard at certain positions. Like, you know, at running back, for example, like, okay, how was the team's offensive line? Were they winning or losing a lot of games? Like, were they competing with other players? Like people were like critical of Alvin Kamara because I think he like had very limited play time in college, but you know, like that, he's a pretty good player. Like, so I think just really like, to me, it's like using analytics to point out like red flags, but at the same time, I do think that there's a lot of validity to the like, and you guys are probably familiar with like the analytics concept of like the draft, and you know, the draft's a lot more of a crapshoot than you think, and like people are pretty certain about draft picks, but in reality, like if a GM or a decision maker is like 95% sure a guy's going to be good, it's probably like the guy's like maybe a 50% chance of being good. And so like if you can embrace that and you like, you know, trade down a little bit more and compile more picks, like most of the analytical charts would say that most like trade downs on that like Jimmy Johnson trade chart are actually like wins. So, you know, I think the Eagles did a pretty good trade this year, you know, moving from like 6 to 12 and getting an extra pick. And, you know, different teams like the Giants had a great like analytics trade this year from a standpoint of like they got an extra 1st round pick and a bunch of other stuff. And I think it's definitely important for the draft. Like you don't want to like, if you have like a finite amount of resources in the draft, you don't want to like waste them and everything like that, if that makes sense. And so like the more you can kind of find edges there with the picks. And I mean, you see teams like New England and, you know, more recently, I think like Seattle and Minnesota have been some teams that have like really advocated for like trading down and having a lot of like 2, 3s, and 4s. And like a lot of those guys like hit it like not that much worse than the 1st round picks. And then like you get those guys to those crazy cheap deals, and it's like it really can build your roster up.
Ryan, I have to ask you though, you know, I noticed on Twitter that you either play or want to play fantasy football, and you kind of said, you kind of indicated the receivers, you know, you were like, you should be going heavy receiver early. Is that what you really believe in fantasy over running backs?
Well, I'm in like a PPR league with my friend.
Yeah.
And also like I definitely know the most information and like pay the most attention out of anyone in the league because I was like in the NFL and everything like that. So I think the running back situation is like really murky, like for so many teams. And like I think just specifically for my league and for, probably for a lot of leagues in general, like if you're taking receivers early on, it's like they're pretty reliable guys. Like Devontae Adams, if he's out there, is going to be one of the best receivers. Tyreek Hill, like Stephon Diggs, like those guys are like pretty consistent. But, like on a yearly basis, one, the running backs get hurt a ton. And two, there's so many timeshares and, you never really know like how things are going to shake out. But like partly from my perspective, I'm like, let me take these guaranteed receivers early on and like establish my receiver position. And then I can find some values because the guys in my league have no idea who like Henderson is for the Rams, or like they don't know these guys that are like splitting time for the Jets and stuff like that. And I feel like I can probably scoop them or whatever later. But I think fantasy is cool because there's a lot of really smart guys in fantasy. And like there was times like I was talking to somebody and I'm like, I would use the information that these random nerds on the internet would say in fantasy. Cause like they would say like, this guy's probably they would almost like know the injury reports better. They're like, oh, it's staff. Cause like they like hawk that stuff for like DraftKings or like, rosters and things like that. They might say like, when this guy's active, his target rates, like 43%. And it's like, I'm like, wow, like that's a good tidbit. Let me like tell Jim Schwartz that or whatever. Like it, like there would literally be times they would do stuff and I'm like, that was really good. I never even would have thought of that. Like, so I was kind of like a no stone unturned mentality. I just like show whoever, if it came on the internet, like who cares? Like if it helps us win, like sounds good.
All right. One last question before we get you out of here, Ryan. We're going to put you on the spot just a little bit here because you did have the opportunity to meet with Nick Sirianni, I believe, as he was deciding on his new staff of coaches and players and front office, I believe. So in that conversation, if you don't mind talking to us, what kind of vibe you got from Nick, and in particularly how he might feel about some of the work that you had done? Clearly, obviously, you're not with the staff anymore. So do you get any sense that he differs from Chip or Doug on how he sees or views some of the work that you were doing for both of those coaches?
So just from talking to Nick, like I don't know, like when this was determined or whatnot, but like he wasn't going to have somebody that was like really like exclusively specifically focused on that role. Mm-hmm. And so like, if there was ever going to be an opportunity for me with the Eagles to stick around, like it would have been something way different. And, it was time, like I was really tight with Coach Pederson and Coach Schwartz. And like, I kind of wanted, to take a step back and look at some new challenges and things like that. So I enjoyed my time there and everything like that. And I have like absolutely no hard feelings. And like, I'm really fortunate that, like my brother is working with Nick Sirianni. Like he says great things. Like, I don't want to give away any inside information, but like, he's like, Nick's awesome. Like, he's the players love him, like he's just a really great guy. And, I think in general, I would say, I think he's going to copy Frank Reich, like really tried to like duplicate some of the stuff that I was doing in Philly when he went to the Colts. And I think to some degree you could see Nick just from like having Frank as his mentor doing something a little bit similar. Now, I really don't know like how they're handling the in-game stuff, but I would guess that somebody must be doing something to help out to some degree. But I would assume that there's a little bit less of a weight on it compared to Doug. Like if you look at, we led the league in fourth downs by a large margin and led the league in 2-point attempts by a large margin and things like that. Like it would be kind of hard to like match that as Coach Sirianni, but maybe he plans on doing that like week one and all of a sudden it's like bombs away and everything. Like I really couldn't tell you like how that's going to shake out, but I certainly, hope that he has success, and I hope the fan base in general just like gives him a shot, because I think that, that if there's one critique of the fan base is like, they're so quick to like turn on these coaches that are like pretty good. Like Andy Reid's one of the best coaches in NFL history. And like the fan base basically acted like he was like just a joke by the end. And like Chip won 10 games, both of his first 2 years. And like, he took some chances the third year, Chip had no I'm not gonna say no quarterback, but like, that the quarterback situation was unsettled his entire time with the Eagles. And, he won whatever it was 27 games at 3 years. Like, that's not bad. Like, but they acted like, Chip's the worst human on earth. Like I don't know about that. Like even this last year, like fire Doug Peterson's trending on Twitter or whatever. It's like, you guys know he won the Super Bowl. And like, then 2 years after there was like catastrophic amounts of injuries and he like coached his ass off and like, got in the playoffs. And realistically, if there wasn't like a wide open drop in a playoff game, like he might've gone to another Super Bowl. Like, so I think just, I know the fans are passionate and it's great that they're passionate and everything like that. But even just like, I can remember specifically, we played the Raiders in 2017 and it was like a Monday Night Football game or whatever, and they were booing Nick Foles. And it's like, guess what? Nick Foles won you guys a Super Bowl like a couple weeks later. Like, do you guys regret booing him? Like, that wasn't helping. But yeah, it's great that they care and all that.
Who knew
that? But maybe there'll be some bumps on the road for Coach Sirianni. I know they got some tough games early on, but just give him a shot. And even I think some of those the fans were like, they didn't even want to give Doug a shot after a year, and then the second year, like, great things happen. So give him a shot, see what happens, and go Eagles, I guess.
Well, you have either grown up or coached. I mean, look, you're from New England, so you know about that Patriots fan base. It's wild, it's rabid as well, big market. Then Dallas, while you were there for a year, that's a very big market as well. And then, of course, you come to Philadelphia and learn and get adapted to an even bigger fan base and more rabid. So you've seen it all from the fans, no doubt about that. I want to make sure we get everything right. On Twitter, you're at Paganetti Ryan, right?
Yep.
Paganetti Ryan at Paganetti Ryan. So everybody should follow you because you just started to get on Twitter now, and I have a feeling you're going to be one of those guys who just starts putting some really good breakdowns and analytics information, and you're going to really take off from there. And let us know what else. Where are you doing? Any other work that people can find at the moment?
I actually, I just started this Twitter account in the last couple of days, and I've got a bunch of people that are like asking me, pulling me in a couple different ways, and I'm gonna figure out what the best thing to do is.
Good.
I'm doing a little bit of like consulting stuff, and I'm having actually fun like consulting for college in particular, just because it's like a totally different challenge, and there's a lot of different questions, and I think there's less of like a lens on some of these different college programs where like they can try to buy into some analytical controversial strategy because no one's really paying attention, as opposed to the NFL. You do something controversial, then like Skip Bayless is talking about you. So like, it's a little bit different, but
no more plugs for that guy on this show.
Yeah.
This is a really good content show. We don't need that on here.
He's the king of trolls. That's all I can say.
You're right about that. All right. So we'll follow your Twitter account at Paganetti Ryan, and follow you there and be able to figure out what you're doing going forward. And of course, we're going to have to bring you on again. I mean, you're just too much. You're a fountain of information.
Yeah.
So at some point during the season, we'll bring you on. Maybe we'll just go through every single fourth down that the Eagles either decide to go for it or not, and kind of analyze it from an analytics standpoint. So Ryan, we really appreciate it. You've given us a lot. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. Just let me know, and I'm happy to hop back on.
You got it. All right. We also have to thank our friends at Sky Motor Cars. Go visit them at skymotorcars.com. If you're buying a car or even trading one in, you'll get the most money from Sky Motor Cars. So thanks to them. Thanks to Deal Dash. Thanks to DraftKings. And, of course, thanks to Ryan Paganetti for joining us and giving us all this great information on the analytics, the Eagles, and the NFL. For Ryan, for Adam Kaplan, I'm Jeff Mosher. Thanks for watching Inside the Birds TV.